Welcome to Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. Find us on snoozecast.com and follow us on Instagram @snoozecast to find behind-the-scenes content. If you would like to get an email once a week with upcoming sleep stories and other news, subscribe to the Snoozeletter at snoozecast.com. This episode is brought to you by our Patreon supporters and by Glowing Embers. Tonight, we'll read another excerpt from The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame, published in 1908. This story centers around 4 small animals: mole, rat, toad, and badger. Their stories take place in the countryside of Edwardian England. If you'd like to start with the first episode, it aired on March 22nd, 2021. To follow along easily in order, go to snoozecast.com/series. Grahame grew up on the River Thames. As Secretary of the Bank of England, he told his son bedtime stories that evolved into this book after he took an early retirement. In the last episode, the innocent mole isn't content with hibernating over winter in the cozy domicile of his friend the water rat. He becomes obsessed with finding the mysterious Mr. Badger, who lives somewhere in the wild wood. Mole sets out to find him, and the rat goes out to rescue him when he gets lost. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. After some toil, the water rat's efforts at digging away snow were rewarded in the middle of the wild wood. A very shabby doormat lay exposed to view. "There, what did I tell you?" exclaimed the rat in great triumph. "Really, rat," said the mole, quite pettishly, "I think we'd had enough of this folly. It's a doormat. Who ever heard of a doormat telling anyone anything? They simply don't do it. They're not that sort at all. Doormats know their place. Now, look here, you thick-headed beast," growled the rat. "This must stop. Not another word, but scrape and scratch and dig and hunt around, especially on the sides of the hummocks, if you want to sleep dry and warm tonight, for it's our last chance." The rat dug into a snowbank besides them with ardor, probing with his shovel everywhere, and then digging with fury. And the mole scraped busily too, more to oblige the rat than for any other reason, for his opinion was that his friend was getting lightheaded. Some 10 minutes hard work, and the point of the rat's shovel struck something that sounded hollow. He worked till he could get a paw through and feel, then called the mole to come and help him. Hard at it went the 2 animals, till at last the result of their labors stood in full view of the astonished and hitherto incredulous mole. In the side of what had seemed to be a snowbank stood a solid-looking little door, painted a dark green. An iron bell hung by the side, and below it, on a small brass plate, neatly engraved in square capital letters, they could read by the aid of moonlight, Mr. Badger. The mole fell backwards on the snow with sheer surprise and delight. "Rat," he cried in penitence, "you're a wonder, a real wonder, that's what you are. I see it all now. You're so clever. I believe you could find anything you liked. You ought to go where you'll be properly appreciated. You're simply wasted here among us fellows. If I only had your head, Ratty—" "But you haven't," interrupted the rat, rather unkindly. "I suppose you're going to sit on the snow all night and talk. Get up at once and hang on to that bell and ring hard as you can, while I hammer on the door knocker." While the rat attacked the door knocker, the mole sprang up at the bell, clutched it, and swung there, both feet well off the ground, and from quite a long way off they could faintly hear a deep-toned bell respond. They waited patiently for what seemed a very long time, stamping in the snow to keep their feet warm. At last, they heard the sound of slow, shuffling footsteps approaching the door from the inside. It seemed, as the mole remarked to the rat, like someone walking in carpet slippers that were too large for him and down at heel, which was intelligent of Mole, because that was exactly what it was. There was the noise of a bolt shot back, and the door opened a few inches, enough to show a long snout and a pair of sleepy, blinking eyes. "Now, the very next time this happens," said a gruff and suspicious voice, "I shall be exceedingly angry. Who is it this time, disturbing people on such a night? Speak up." "Oh, Badger," cried the rat, "let us in, please. It's me, Rat, and my friend Mole, and we've lost our way in the snow." "What, Ratty, my dear little man!" exclaimed the Badger, in quite a different voice. "Come along in, both of you, at once. Why, you must be perished. Well, I never. Lost in the snow, and in the wild wood, too, and at this time of night. But come in with you." The two animals stumbled over each other in their eagerness to get inside, and heard the door shut behind them with great joy and relief. The Badger, who wore a long dressing gown, and whose slippers were indeed very down at heel, carried a flat candlestick in his paw, and had probably been on his way to bed when their summons sounded. He looked kindly down on them and patted both their heads. "This is not the sort of night for small animals to be out," he said paternally. "I'm afraid you've been up to some of your pranks again, Ratty. But come along. Come into the kitchen. There's a first-rate fire there, and supper and everything." He shuffled on in front of them, carrying the light, and they followed him, nudging each other in an anticipating sort of way, down a long, and to tell the truth, decidedly shabby passage, into a sort of central hall, out of which they could dimly see other long, tunnel-like passages branching, passages mysterious and without apparent end. But there were doors in the hall as well, stout, oaken, comfortable-looking doors. One of these the badger flung open, and at once they found themselves in all the glow and warmth of a large, fire-lit kitchen. The floor was well-worn red brick, and on the wide hearth burnt a fire of logs between two attractive chimney corners tucked away in the wall, well out of any suspicion of draught. A couple of high-backed chairs, facing each other on either side of the fire, gave further sitting accommodations for the sociably disposed. In the middle of the room stood a long table of plain boards pressed on trestles, with benches down each side. At one end of it, where an armchair stood pushed back, were spread the remains of the badger's plain but ample supper. Rows of spotless plates winked from the shelves of the dresser at the far end of the room, and from the rafters overhead hung hams, bundles of dried herbs, nets of onions, and baskets of eggs. It seemed a place where heroes could fitly feast after victory, where weary harvesters could line up in scores along the table and keep their harvest home with mirth and song, or where 2 or 3 friends of simple tastes could sit about as they pleased and eat and smoke and talk in comfort and contentment. The ruddy brick floor smiled up at the smoky ceiling. The oaken chairs, shiny with long wear, exchanged cheerful glances with each other. Plates on the dresser grinned at pots on the shelf, and the merry firelight flickered and played over everything without distinction. The kindly badger thrust them down on a chair to toast themselves at the fire, and bade them remove their wet coats and boots. Then he fetched them dressing gowns and slippers, and himself bathed the mole's shin with warm water. In the embracing light and warmth, warm and dry at last, the weary legs propped up in front of them, and a suggestive clink of plates being arranged on the table behind, it seemed to the storm-driven animals, now in safe anchorage, that the cold and trackless wild wood just left outside was miles and miles away, and all that they had suffered in it a half-forgotten dream. When at last they were thoroughly toasted, the badger summoned them to the table where he had been busy laying a repast. They had felt pretty hungry before, but when they actually saw at last the supper that was spread for them, really it seemed only a question of what they should dive into first, where all were so attractive, and whether the other things would obligingly wait for them till they had time to give them attention. Conversation was impossible for a long time, and when it was slowly resumed, it was that regrettable sort of conversation that results from talking with your mouth full. The badger did not mind that sort of thing at all, nor did he take any notice of elbows on the table or everybody speaking at once. As he did not go into society himself, he had got an idea that these things belonged to the things that didn't really matter. We know, of course, that he was wrong and took too narrow a view, because they do matter very much, though it would take too long to explain why. He sat in his armchair at the head of the table and nodded gravely at intervals as the animals told their story, and he did not seem surprised or shocked at anything, and he never said, "I told you so," or "just what I always said," or remarked that they ought to have done so and so, or ought not to have done something else. The mole began to feel very friendly towards him. When supper was really finished at last, and each animal felt that his skin was now as tight as was decently safe, and that by this time he didn't care a hang for anybody or anything, they gathered round the glowing embers of the great wood fire and thought how jolly it was to be sitting up so late and so independent and so full. And after they had chatted for a time about things in general, the badger said heartily, "Now then, tell us the news from your part of the world. How's old Toad doing?" "Oh, not well," said the rat gravely, while the mole, cocked up on a chair and basking in the firelight, his heels higher than his head, tried to look properly mournful. "Another smash-up only last week, you see. He'll insist on driving himself, and he's hopelessly incapable." "How many smash-ups has he had?" inquired the badger gloomily. "Smashes or machines?" asked the rat. "Oh, well, after all, it's all the same thing with Toad. This is the 7th. He's a hopelessly bad driver, and quite regardless of law and order. Badger, we're his friends. Oughtn't we to do something?" The badger went through a bit of hard thinking. "Now look here," he said at last. "Of course you know I can't do anything now." His two friends assented, quite understanding his point. No animal, according to the rules of animal etiquette, is ever expected to do anything strenuous or heroic or even moderately active during the off-season of winter. All are sleepy, some actually asleep. All around are weather-bound, more or less, and all are resting from arduous days and nights during which every muscle in them has been severely tested and every energy kept at full stretch. "Very well, then," continued the badger, "but when once the year has really turned and the nights are shorter, and halfway through them one rouses and feels fidgety and wanting to be up and doing things by sunrise, if not before, you know." Both animals nodded gravely. They knew. "Well then," went on the badger, "we, that is, you and me and our friend the mole here, we'll take Toad seriously in hand. We'll make him be a sensible toad. You're asleep, Rat." "Not me," said the rat, waking up with a jerk. "He's been asleep 2 or 3 times since supper," said the mole, laughing. He himself was feeling quite wakeful and even lively, though he didn't know why. The reason, of course, was that he was naturally an underground animal by birth and breeding. The situation of Badger's house exactly suited him and made him feel at home, while the rat, who slept every night in a bedroom the windows of which opened on a breezy river, naturally felt the atmosphere still and heavy. "Well, it's time we were all in bed," said the badger, getting up and fetching fat, flat candlesticks. "Come along, you two, and I'll show you your quarters. And take your time tomorrow morning. Breakfast at any hour you please." He conducted the two animals to a long room that seemed half bedchamber and half loft. The badger's winter stores, which indeed were visible everywhere, took up half the room. Piles of apples, turnips, and potatoes, baskets full of nuts, and jars of honey. But the two little white beds on the remainder of the floor looked soft and inviting, and the linen on them, though coarse, was clean and smelt beautifully of lavender. And the mole and the water rat, shaking off their garments in some 30 seconds, tumbled in between the sheets in great joy and contentment. In accordance with the kindly badger's injunctions, the two tired animals came down to breakfast very late next morning and found a bright fire burning in the kitchen and two young hedgehogs sitting on a bench at the table, eating oatmeal porridge out of wooden bowls. The hedgehogs dropped their spoons, rose to their feet, and ducked their heads respectfully as the two entered. "There, sit down, said the rat pleasantly, "and go on with your porridge. Where have you youngsters come from? Lost your way in the snow, I suppose?" "Yes, please, sir," said the elder of the two hedgehogs respectfully. "Me and little Billy here, we were trying to find our way to school. Mother would have us go. Was the weather ever so? And of course we lost ourselves, sir. And Billy, he got frightened and took and cried, being young and faint-hearted. And at last we happened up against Mr. Badger's back door, and made so bold as to knock, sir. For Mr. Badger, he's a kind-hearted gentleman, as everyone knows." "I understand," said the rat, cutting himself some rashers from a side of bacon, while the mole dropped some eggs into a saucepan. "And what's the weather like outside? You needn't sir me quite so much," he added. "Oh, sir, terrible steep the snow is," said the hedgehog. "No getting out for the likes of you gentlemen today." "Where's Mr. Badger?" inquired the mole as he warmed the coffee pot before the fire. "The master's gone into his study, sir," replied the hedgehog, "and he said he was so particularly busy this morning, and on no account was he to be disturbed." This explanation, of course, was thoroughly understood by everyone present. The fact is, as already set forth, when you live a life of intense activity for 6 months in the year, and of comparative or actual somnolence for the other 6, during the latter period, you cannot be continually pleading sleepiness when there are people about or things to be done. The excuse gets monotonous. The animals well knew that Badger, having eaten a hearty breakfast, had retired to his study and settled himself in an armchair with his legs up on another, and a red cotton handkerchief over his face, and was being busy in the usual way at this time of year. The front bell clanged loudly, and the rat, who was very greasy with buttered toast, sent Billy, the smaller hedgehog, to see who it might be. There was a sound of much stamping in the hall, and presently Billy returned in front of the otter, who threw himself on the rat with an embrace and a shout of affectionate greeting. "Get off," spluttered the rat with his mouth full. "Thought I should find you here all right," said the otter cheerfully. They were all in a great state of alarm along River Bank when I arrived this morning. Rat never been home all night, nor Mole either. Something dreadful must have happened, they said, and the snow had covered up all your tracks, of course. But I knew that when people were in any fix, they mostly went to Badger, or else Badger got to know of it somehow. So I came straight off here, through the wild wood and the snow. My, it was fine, coming through the snow as the red sun was rising and showing against the black tree trunks. As you went along in the stillness, every now and then masses of snow slid off the branches suddenly with a big flop, making you jump and run for cover. Snow castles and snow caverns had sprung up out of nowhere in the night, and snow bridges, terraces, ramparts. I could have stayed and played with them for hours. Here and there, great branches had been torn away by the sheer weight of the snow, and robins perched and hopped on them in their perky, conceited way, just as if they had done it themselves. A ragged string of wild geese passed overhead, high on the gray sky, and a few rooks whirled over the trees, inspected, and flapped off homewards. But I met no sensible being to ask the news of. About halfway across, I came on a rabbit sitting on a stump, cleaning his silly face with his paws. He was pretty scared when I crept up behind him. I had to cuff his head to get any sense out of it at all. At last I managed to extract from him that Mole had been seen in the wildwood last night by one of them. It was the talk of the burrows, he said. How Mole, Mr. Rat's particular friend, was in a bad fix. How he had lost his way. And they were up and out hunting. Then why didn't you do anything? I asked.